You fight the promise of satisfaction that sin gives you with the promise of a superior satisfaction. And therefore, the root of sin, which is the promise of joy or the promise of happiness or the promise of satisfaction, is severed. You sever the root of sin with the acts of faith in future grace.
You ever notice how temptation doesn't just tell you to do something wrong? It actually promises you'll feel good if you do. That's why willpower alone isn't enough to combat temptation. I'm Dan Kruver. In this episode of Light and Truth, John Piper shows how faith fights sin, not by saying no harder, but by trusting the promise of something better. This message was originally delivered at the EFAC National Conference in Melbourne, Australia on June 27, 1996.
What is it about faith? What is it about saving faith that necessarily produces love or holiness or ministry? Now, the key answer there is, I believe, two things. First, it is the future orientation of faith on future grace. And then secondly, it's going to be the nature of faith as satisfaction in God. But let me take them one at a time. The point I'm at now in my exposition is, what is the biblical nature of saving faith such that it inevitably transforms life into holiness and love? That's my question. And my first answer is, saving faith has a future orientation on the promises of future grace. Now, to make this plain, I need to explain what I mean by future grace. I find that in American evangelicalism, of the conservative, evangelistic variety that I hail from, saving faith is almost always considered in a past tense. You ask somebody if they're a Christian, and they say, I believed. I, once upon a time, trusted Christ. When I was 6 or 26, put my faith in Jesus. They look back to a point which is an absolutely crucial point, but I fear that for many of them, they do not understand that saving faith is not merely a backward look at the atonement and the resurrection, but a forward look at grace coming to them moment by moment, on which they must rely as a part of their saving faith. Let me try to illustrate this for some text so you can see what I mean by future grace. Paul said in 1 Corinthians 15:10, by the grace of God, I am what I am. And His grace toward me did not prove vain, but I labored more than all of them, yet it was not I, but the grace of God that was with me. By the grace of God, I am what I am. I labored more than all of them. Nevertheless, it is not I, but the grace of God that is with me. Every time Paul stretches forth to lay hold on that for which he has been laid hold on, that stretching, that accepting the whip on his back, that shipwreck willingness to sacrifice, that being in danger on the roads and in the cities, that obedience is a laying hold on and a receiving of grace. It is not I doing this. It is the future grace of God coming to me moment by moment. So when I say future, I mean the grace that I will need to finish this sentence and the grace that I will need to live forever in God's presence in heaven. Future grace is every grace that arrives from now, and that one's now past. I'm still alive. Till now, and that one's now past. I'm alive still believing. Isn't that amazing? I'm still a Christian, and I was 5 seconds ago, and I still am. That's grace, all grace. And what I'll need this afternoon, what I'll need on Monday to keep the plane up, and what I'll need that night to greet my wife in love, and what I'll need to stay in the ministry, this is all grace, and I must have it, and I must depend on it to be a Christian. If I live in the power of my flesh and not on the power of future grace, I'm not a believer. Therefore, faith is fundamentally future-oriented. We'll talk maybe a little bit tomorrow about the crucial place of bygone grace, especially the cross and the resurrection. But I'm stressing now that the life-changing power that produces love and holiness and ministry in faith is its future orientation on the grace of God that's promised to us. Let me give you another illustration from the text. This hit me a couple of years ago. This is when I was getting that book ready. Have you ever noticed, I had never noticed this before, that at the beginning of every single one of Paul's letters, without exception, there is some form of the phrase, grace to you. Grace to you. Sometimes it says grace and peace. Sometimes it says grace and mercy. Always grace to you. And have you noticed, which I didn't, that at the end of every letter, without exception, it says some form of grace be with you. Never to you. It's never with you at the beginning of the letter. It's never to you at the end of the letter. It's always grace to you at the beginning and grace be with you at the end. Why? I mean, that is so consistent. It is so amazing. It calls for an explanation. I've never seen that commented on in any commentary I've ever read. It was one of those exciting discoveries, and I've never heard anybody address why that is. Now, I'm sure they have, and I don't know everything in the universe, but I'd never seen anybody, and so I tried to figure it out, and here's my little suggestion. You test it. Paul writes the letter. He knows that it'll be opened in Ephesus or Thessalonica or Colossae, and they will begin to read it before this congregation that has no Bible. And what he's saying is, as you gather under the Word, the apostolic Word, to hear it read, grace is coming to you right now through this book. Grace through the Word of God is coming to you. So he begins the letter, grace to you. It's flowing to you in the exposition. It's flowing to you in the reading of the Word. Now, they read it. Takes a half an hour or so. They pause for exposition, maybe a little longer, and they come to the end of the letter as they're reading it in the worship or in the assembly. And he's there, as it were, in his apostolic word, and he realizes soon the service will be over. And all these people will enter back the first century pagan world with broken homes and recalcitrant teenagers and sick bodies and difficult times at work and crises in their lives. Will grace go with them when they leave? And he says, grace be with you. It's going to go with you now. Now, the only point of my stressing this is that grace is not merely an attitude in the mind of God that prompts Him to do things, nor is it merely an expression of saving power in the cross. Grace is an outpouring of beneficence and power now. Now in the preaching of this Word, and as you leave from here and go back to your parishes, grace be with you. Grace will be with you. It'll keep showering down. It'll just keep coming down. And my point is, saving faith is faith in that. Do you believe that? Do you believe that? When you leave here, will faith be reaching out one moment into the future in the crisis that you're going to have as that couple is arriving in your office ready to divorce? Will you believe, when you open your mouth, I will fill it. I'll give you the wisdom you need. Do you believe in future grace for counseling, future grace for crises, future grace for your own health, future grace for your own marriage, future grace for that kid that's not where he ought to be? Saving faith is not different from that faith. There is one faith that saves, and it is faith in grace, past and future. Oh, there's so many texts here that I could read. I think those are enough, perhaps, except maybe one more. 2 Corinthians 9:8. God is able to make all grace abound to you, so that always having sufficiency in everything, you may have an abundance for every good deed. Grace is the abundant supply of enablement for every good deed. And therefore, when Paul says in Romans 9:32 that we are to obey the law by faith, he means, do you trust the enabling power of God according to the new covenant promise that He will be there to help you and enable you and sustain you in all of your crises and challenges of obedience? So my first answer to the question, how it is that saving faith always changes life, always produces love and holiness, is that it has a future orientation on future grace. And in trusting that grace, you are freed from the power of sin. Now, I'm jumping ahead here. Let me bring in my second answer before I finish explaining that. The second answer to why faith produces love or ministry or holiness is that faith is a being satisfied with all that God is for us in Jesus. Faith is, at its essence, a being satisfied with all that God promises to be for you in Jesus. So not only does faith have a future orientation on grace, that future orientation is a being satisfied in that grace that is held out in the promises of God for this afternoon and tomorrow and your eternity. This means that faith is not merely intellectual. Faith is also affective. It is a resting in and an enjoying of and a being satisfied by all that God promises to be for you in Jesus. Now you should ask, where do you get that? What is your textual warrant for such a definition of faith? Let me just mention maybe two texts and then we'll wind it up. For example, John 6:35. Jesus said to them, I am the bread of life. He who comes to me shall not hunger, and he who believes in me shall never thirst. Now compare the two halves of that verse. He who comes to me shall not hunger. He who believes in me shall never thirst. In Johannine theology, coming to Jesus and believing in Jesus are virtually synonymous. And this text says, therefore, I believe, that faith or believing in Jesus is a coming to Jesus to find our thirst satisfied in Him. He who comes to me shall not hunger. He who believes in me shall never thirst. Come to me. Hebrews 11:6 says, without faith it is impossible to please God. For he who comes must believe that He is, and that He is the, what? Rewarder of those who seek Him. Faith is a coming to God for satisfaction. It is a coming to God for Himself as the rewarder of all things. He sums up all reward in Himself. Here's another text. This one's a little more complicated. Verses 8 and 9. Paul says, I count all things to be loss in view of the surpassing value of knowing Christ Jesus my Lord, for whom I have suffered the loss of all things, and count them but rubbish, that I may gain Christ. Now let's just stop there and notice. How does he mean to gain Christ? By having Christ as his surpassing value and counting everything else as rubbish. I count everything as rubbish because of the surpassing value of knowing Christ, that I may gain Christ. I take that to mean that no one will gain Christ who does not count Christ to be a superior value than everything else in the world, which is rubbish by comparison. That's the way we gain Christ. But now verse 9 says, and may be found in him, not having a righteousness of my own, derived from the law, but that which is through faith in Christ, the righteousness which comes from God on the basis of faith. Now, how do you get right with God and gain Christ according to verse 9? Answer, by faith. There is a righteousness imputed to you that comes from God through faith. Now, how can both verse 8 and verse 9 be true? Verse 9 says, we are accepted by God, received by God, welcomed into the fellowship of God, and the righteousness of His Son imputed to us so that we're acceptable to God by faith. Verse 8 says, I gain Christ by counting Him my superior value and by counting everything else as rubbish. And the answer is, that is the definition of faith. Faith is a coming to Christ to be so satisfied by all that God promises to be for us that we count everything else as rubbish. Which is why I have such a problem with so much cheap, simple, decisionistic evangelism. Oh, how many people are misled by telling them that one simple intellectual act of signing a card or praying a prayer will make them a Christian. A Christian is a new creature, supernaturally brought from death to life and given values radically different than the old man, such that we say, Christ is my superior value above all things, and I count everything as rubbish because of the surpassing value of knowing Him. And I have other texts here I could use, but let me just stop with those. Faith is a being satisfied with all that God is for us in Jesus. Now I can go back and answer the question that I posed way back at the beginning and draw this to a close. The question halfway through was, why does saving faith always produce a life of transformation? Always produce a life of holiness and love? And I answered two things. It has a future orientation, and now secondly, that orientation is a being satisfied with all that God promises to be for us in Jesus. Now that doesn't quite answer it yet. To answer it, I need to go back and connect it with our first question. How does last night's message relate to this one? Last night I said that you are strengthened for holiness by God's inspiring in you the pursuit of your pleasure in God. Now I have defined faith as a being satisfied in God and all that He promises to be for you. Those two things are the same. I'm now arguing that saving faith is a resting in, a pursuit of, a reliance upon God to satisfy our hearts in Him. And a living by faith, an obedience of faith, a work of faith is an act of obedience that flows from our delight in God. Now here's the way it works. This is the bottom line. Sin, which is the opposite of holiness, and lack of love, which is the opposite of love, have their power in your life because of one thing, the promises they make to you. None of you sins out of duty. Not one. Nobody gets up in the morning and says, I'm feeling especially holy today, but I guess I ought to sin, so I'll sin. Nobody sins out of duty. We only sin for one reason. Sin makes promises of happiness. That's the only reason anybody sins. It makes promises of superior satisfaction. It's a lie. And how do you triumph over that lie and over that power that sin has? By making promises to you? And the answer is now living by faith in future grace. That is, you fight promises with promises. You fight the promise of satisfaction that sin gives you with the promise of a superior satisfaction. And therefore, the root of sin, which is the promise of joy or the promise of happiness or the promise of satisfaction, is severed. You sever the root of sin with the axe of faith in future grace. But I mentioned yesterday these movies that were on the TV screen in the planes. What do you do with the temptation to look and dwell and fantasize about what's there? What do you look? The promise that is coming out of the screen is, I'll make you happy. You'll be more comfortable. You'll have thrills. You'll have bodily sensations that will be so good. You'll feel better if you look, dwell, and then fantasize some more. What do you do with that? If you try to fight that with the raw power of duty, you will fail in the long run, or you will become a brittle, hard-nosed legalist. The way you fight it is that you close your eyes and you remind yourself of superior promises and superior satisfaction. You say, the steadfast love of the Lord is better than life. You say, Jesus said, better to gouge out your eye than to lust, because it's better to go to heaven and enjoy the bliss of eternity than to go to hell with two eyes. You say, He's pursuing me with goodness and mercy all of my days. How can I ram the sword into Christ's side who died for my purity? You remind yourself of all the blessings that come from walking in the light of the Lord. And then that promise coming out of that screen is severed in its power by the power of a superior promise and a superior satisfaction. So last night's message and this morning's message are one message. Living by faith and pursuing satisfaction in God, which glorifies God, is the same thing. Because faith is a being satisfied with all that God is for us in Jesus.
This is Light and Truth, God-centered preaching to help you see Christ clearly and treasure Him truly. I'm your host, Dan Kruver. Thank you for listening. On our next episode, John Piper continues our 10-part series, Strength for Those Who Wait, with a message titled, Why Faith Bears Fruit. I hope you'll join us. For more resources, visit desiringgod.org.